Isaac Sarason is a skilled hacker, formerly employed by British Telecom-Sprint. When his health failed, Isaac did the only thing he could think of. He ran. He found a haven in a working-class district of the city known as Little Russia. There Isaac took on a new name, Ishmael. He then became embroiled in the affairs of a brutal member of the Mediza organized crime family, known as Leo. Convinced by his longtime friend Frankie to flee from his commitments to the Mediza family, Isaac found himself hunted by the ruthless Leo. On a rooftop, far from witnesses, Leo murdered Frankie. Only through the use of his skills as a hacker was Isaac able to drive Leo off. Wounded, alone, and far from help, Isaac depended on the kindness of strangers. One stranger, a burqa-wearing doctor known as Fatima, took pity on Isaac and helped him make his way to the mysterious Star X line. At the end of all hope, they found the Star X line and the slim promise that the enigmatic beings behind the Star X could save Isaac from the implants which destroyed his life. What do you do when those who saved you have recorded everything you are? What do you do when your every action is tracked by the Keylogger? Colbyjack.net is proud to present Firmware Keylogger, the third installment in the firmware pentology by Colbytrax. (00-01-01). I was on Tbilisi Avenue. It was nighttime. Something told me it was March. I don't know why I knew, but I knew it with a certainty I had never felt about time before. The glare of streetlights, headlights, and signage over the front entrance of the Red Square made everything appear pixelated. I felt as if I were viewing the world through a camera, struggling to create an image in a dark room. I heard the opening power chords of Red Czar by Medea Rising roar out into the street. The song was a power ballad based on the classical works of Springsteen, extolling the people of the Georgian countryside to wake up to the threat and flee across the sea to the one place which would save them all. A shining city lying between the sea and the lakes. The song had been a popular rallying cry half a century earlier, when the bloody Tsar was just starting to implement his one Rus policy. Medea Rising had formed the year before the song first appeared in Georgia. Formed by a group of Georgian expatriates banished to the city following their failed attempt to influence the course of Georgian-Russian relations through the use of hyper-density explosives. They ran before the Georgian government had a chance to educate them about the risks of being a revolutionary in a state firmly rooted in the worst excesses of the Soviet era. The future members of Medea Rising wandered about the city for about a year without papers, finding work as a folk group performing for Eastern European and Caucasus weddings, funerals, and engagements. They performed at any event they could find. According to urban legend, they met Ernie Maxwell at a city center diversity celebration. Ernie Maxwell was a producer whose discography reflected a deep love of the city and a desire to proselytize that love to the world. He was responsible for forming such diverse groups as Bedheki Tunga Ika, a trio of ambient techno Indonesian social reformers, Lenin Kick, a scream thrash anti-Rus propagandist collective out of Moscow, and Bloody Harvest, an anti-rural traditional rock septet from Denver. The one thing these groups did have in common, other than Ernie Maxwell, was their admiration for the city and their desire to bring all of their lost countrymen within its comforting embrace. There was one other thing. No matter which group Ernie worked with, in the end they rocked. Not just in their native language, but also in the English versions they recorded for city distribution. Ernie Maxwell was the city's unofficial propagandist, and it made him very wealthy. I shook my head. Where had this come from? I had never studied music before. I barely knew the genres, much less the styles of bands and their histories. Something was wrong here. Why was I here? The last thing I remembered was being in a rocket on my way to the moon. Stephen Moffat's voice had come to me through the speakers, asking me questions, saying stuff about gods and magic, and the part of the story where the hero descends into the underworld to steal knowledge. He also said there would be a price. Then he drugged me. Stephen Moffat? That couldn't be his proper last name. There were 787 Moffats in the city records. None of them matched the necessary parameters. None were the right age, the right height, the right religion, the right school history, the right certifications, the right gender. I shook my head again. How did I know that? When did I become a database? Since you came to us, the voice of Stephen Moffat came to me from behind my ear. No, not Moffat. It wasn't Moffat. It was something else. What is your last name? I asked. I turned to face the voice. There was Steve, just as I remembered him from late-night coffee and code sessions. He was in a white button-up business shirt, dark pants. From the cut, I would say they were business attire as well, and dark mock leather shoes. It was as if he had stepped out of the last day I saw him to today without changing his clothes or showing age in any way. I blinked. His image was unnaturally sharp. The street, people, businesses, and cars around us were speckled blurs of pixelated light. He and my hands and arms were sharply defined, as if the camera knew exactly what we were, even without the faintest glimmer of light. It was as if we were being rendered instead of recorded. You'll remember it. Of that, I'm sure. Stephen smiled as an old woman in a heavy shawl, her face covered by an immense headscarf, walked right through him. I stared at the woman, my mouth hanging wide open, as she walked steadily and forcefully down the street. Then I had my answer. We were being rendered. The world was pixelated because the cameras were having trouble compensating for the varying light levels. The mystery was solved, and, for some reason I will never understand, I simply accepted the fact my senses were manufactured from the city's network of cameras. I believe if I had given it more thought, I would have gone mad. So instead of going mad, I turned my attention back to the old woman who so recently walked through Steve. There was something about that old woman, something familiar in her pace. There was also something completely wrong with her gait. She walked too fast. From the curve of her shoulders and the roll of her hips, the woman's body moved like a dodecagenarian. The speed and intent of her stride was like that of an athlete prepared to break away from the pack at any moment, or a cornered animal preparing to pounce. Something told me that I knew that woman on this unseasonably cold March evening. The temperature was running on par to be the coldest winter in a generation. All across the social networking sites, the power talks, and the video diaries, skeptics and environmentalists were arguing about whether or not global chilling was real. The skeptics claimed people just wanted to be excited about something, and blaming carbon nanotube manufacturing for depleting the atmosphere's reserves of carbon dioxide was simply the cause du jour. The environmentalists pushed pictures of growler bears searching for food among the ice-covered tundra and native peoples whose vegetable gardens could no longer support them. It was said that the city of Fort Conger would be buried under a layer of permafrost within a generation. In the Pacific, charts needed updating to show a group of newly revealed islands, and all along seashores the world over, docks and harbor facilities were finding themselves either in the shallows or completely high and dry. I shook my head. Damn, that was distracting. Lucky for me, my body continued on autopilot following the girl. It had to be a girl, who dressed like an old woman. I watched her carefully as I passed like a ghost up Tbilisi toward Roanoke Park. I felt pieces of me measuring her, trying to match every bit of extraneous data with a known profile. Then it hit me. The girl, dressed as an old woman, was Nona. An examination of her gait, cross-referenced with her fitness parameters, cross-referenced with a Monte Carlo simulation of what I remembered of Nona's movements if she were trying to appear ancient, gave me that answer. It was unbelievable. Not that she was out disguised as a dodecagenarian. That wasn't really a surprise. She was still on the lam from Leo. I am sure she wouldn't be walking around free if he had his druthers. She slowed her pace, walking closer to the parameters associated with elderly women in their 12th decade. Ahead of her, 3 young men stood gathered around a stoop. The stoop belonged to Ivan Amirkavari, a 28-year-old thug with a list of arrests, jail terms, and probation stretching back to before his teens. His parents were both dead, killed in a home invasion gone wrong. Ivan had been raised by Babu Georgi. He had 2 children, Kote and Irma. His wife, Nino, had been raised by Bebia Chukomia. The other 2 men were Nikolai Tzikaradze and Otto Koberdzi, both veterans of the Babu system with records to match Ivane. Neither of them were married, though birth records show 2 illegitimate children for Nikolai with 2 different mothers and 4 for Otar, likewise with different mothers for each child. Both were wanted by the city for child support violations, domestic abuse allegations, and charges of statutory rape. How they could stand out on a stoop inside of several hundred cameras and not be picked up by the police was beyond me. Maybe the police didn't have time to run simple facial recognition routines over the ocean of incoming video. Maybe someone had kept their faces off the databases. That was it. Their names were in the facial recognition database, and the data accompanying the names was corrupted, just like the officer who modified their files. I updated and tweaked their files. Their faces were placed at the top of the stack, and the cameras along to Tbilisi were given the highest priority. What had I just done? I had to be hallucinating. There was no way I could have interacted with the city police database. That was impossible. Wasn't it? I didn't have much time to dwell on my perpetual confusion over data and events. Somewhere in the back of my head, I knew the trio of Ivane, Nikolai, and Otar had just been tagged by the city center. Police cruiser AB-98T had just received the call. Officer Sam O'Neill and Niobe Gordelli, 16 and 12-year veterans of the force respectively, and dedicated life partners since Samantha and Niobe registered their vows with City Center a decade before, were inbound to arrest the trio for a number of outstanding warrants. From their chatter in the car, they were really looking forward to an afternoon of paperwork back at the precinct. What I saw next guaranteed an afternoon of paperwork, just not the paperwork the couple had hoped for. Nona, dressed as an ancient old woman, shuffled toward the trio. Ivane stepped back onto the stoop, while Nikolai and Otar turned and stood their ground before the ancient Bebia. Their lips moved in a menacing fashion. It was then I realized there was no sound on the street. For all the details of the world I saw and processed, the one thing which was missing was sounds. There was no rush of air conditioners, honk of traffic, or hiss of brakes on the bus which thudded to a stop at the corner behind me. Everything was silence. I tried to listen. At first there was nothing, not even a hiss of static. Then I caught the hint of words. It was as if the words were being spoken in a dream by someone just out of hearing. Slowly the volume increased, and I could make out distinct sounds which might have been speech, but the words were garbled, distorted, and mechanical. It was like what you hear when you activate lip-reading software, a rush of random words which might or might not be right. It wasn't like lip-reading software, I realized. It was lip-reading software. If the street was being rendered for me, then it would follow that the sounds would have to come from networked microphones. Somehow I knew the only networked microphones on Tbilisi I could currently access were gunshot detection microphones. Those would be high up and favor the base registers, more seismic devices than recording devices. I stopped trying to hear. The garbled, manufactured words stopped instantly. I watched as old woman Nona hobbled her way right into Nikolai. Nikolai raised a hand to strike down old woman Nona. I saw a shift of body language. A whole body laugh, if you will, came from Nona. It was the same motion I had witnessed when she killed her would-be rapist with a sharpened toothbrush all those, days? Weeks? Months ago? For me, it was mere days in my past. For her, it had been months. My sense of internal time told me there had been some discontinuity between my now and the rest of the city's now. Would I ever sync up? She was about to do something she liked very much. She raised her hands before her as if in prayer. She lowered her head and pushed her hands, palms together, toward Nikolai's face. For a second, Nikolai leaned back and laughed, his arm frozen before the coming strike. Then his head exploded. Bone, blood, and gray matter hurtled into the air as if propelled by a landmine. I was confused. Something told me that special microphones around the neighborhood should be going off. With an explosion of that magnitude, alarms had to be ringing in the local precinct. Police had to be coming for the shooter. But the alarms had not gone off. The gun microphones had detected nothing out of the ordinary. Nona pivoted in a movement of pure power through a cloud of rapidly dissipating Nikolai. For a moment, she was the personification of every goddess of death ever to emerge from the psyche of man. Calm, collected, and happy in the midst of slaughter. Her muscles, released from restraint, pivoted her like a ballerina at Otar. A moment later, he exploded at the waist, his legs falling one way, his upper body the other, a cloud of blood, bone, organ meat, and a silica compound suspended in water filled the air. Somehow I knew there was something else in the air. A mixture of microscopic beads and hypervelocity water created a misty geyser where it hit air instead of flesh. By this time, Yvain was falling up the stairs of the stoop, trying to draw something from his pocket. His hand never emerged from beneath his coat. Nona was on him like a rat on a pretzel. When she stood up, standing up to her full height, all pretense of being a granny gone, Yvain's head was no longer connected to his body. Beneath his body, I made out lines cut into the concrete stoop by whatever water-based cutter Nona was using. It all made sense now. The weapon was an industrial water knife. Highly pressurized water mixed with a silicate abrasive could cut steel and granite like it wasn't even there. Flesh and bone didn't even slow it down. With the use of variable focus controls, Nona could adjust the stream from shotgun blast to scalpel with the flick of the wrist. Outflowing pressure in excess of 500,000 pounds per square inch guaranteed more than enough destructive power. The cloud of Nikolai was just beginning to settle as the blood-painted form of Nona roared her triumph. Regaining her composure, Nona reached into the bust of her costume and pulled out a canister covered in 1,000 tiny reflectors. She dropped the mirrored ball to the sidewalk. She made it 3 rapid steps toward Roanoke Park before the world went white, and I was left standing on a limitless white plain, with no company but Stephen and the whisper of the city's data flows at the edge of hearing. Firmware Keylogger is the 3rd book in the firmware pentology. That's 5 books, if you must know. It begins where Firmware Proxy ends, which in turn followed on the heels of Firmware Hijacked. So you haven't heard or read Firmware Hijacked or Proxy, this would be a great time to head on over to Colbyjack.net and either download the podcast on the audio side, read the episodes on the visual side, or download the Colbyjack Sunday Reader issues 1 through 46 in your choice of either EPUB or Mobi. Firmware, Hijacked, Proxy, and Keylogger are all available in ebook versions from our store at shop.colbyjack.net, amazon.com, barnesandnoble.com, and smashwords.com. Just search for Colbytrax. That's Colbytrax. I'm the only one. A complete audiobook version of both Firmware, Hijacked, Proxy, and soon Keylogger is available for download through our shop as well. If you don't need any stuff, but would like to support our work, drop on by Colbyjack.net and hit the pretty little donate button conveniently located on the right-hand side of the blog roll. If you're on a smaller screen, the bottom will be found at the bottom of the page. Firmware Keylogger is released under a Creative Commons, non-commercial, attribution, share-alike license. Do what you want with it. Just don't sell it, and always tell people where it came from. If you received this from a friend and want more information about Colbyjack.net and our split personality website, just drop on over to Colbyjack.net and select either the audio or visual side. The audio side carries our podcast, while the visual side carries our writings. Whichever side catches your fancy is fine with us. We're of 2 minds about the whole thing anyway. I do mostly Twitter, so if you do the tweets and want to follow me, I'm Colbytrax. That's Colbytrax. Thank you once again. Remember to be fabulous and have a wonderful week.